Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham. This November, voters will get to decide if California should implement a wealth tax. But that is not the only proposition on our ballots that directly relates to the fiscal impacts on our government or how we raise and spend money. Alongside the wealth tax are two companion measures, Propositions 41 and 42, that have actually been dubbed as poison pills because they have a completely different vision for how California should be handling taxes and raising money in our state, and they directly counteract the effects that Proposition 40, or the wealth tax, would have if passed. So, what do these propositions do? Why were they placed on the ballot? And should you vote for them? We are breaking it all down today. But before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you stay up to date on all things California politics. And if you want more information or you want sources cited in compiling today's episode, you should check out the corresponding article on my website, which is linked below. Now, before we dive into these propositions, I just want to pause and take a moment to recognize that this is episode 100 of the California Conversation. I started all the way back 2 years ago around the same time with the election coming up in 2024, and I started covering propositions. So it's really fun to be right back to where I started covering propositions in this year's election, and also super cool to reach such a milestone in episodes. So thank you to everyone who has stuck with me. Thank you to the new faces who have subscribed around here. And I hope this can be a really helpful resource for you as you navigate life in California. Now, we have two very fun propositions to be talking about today because, yes, they once again relate to taxes. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why are there so many different propositions on our ballot related not just to taxes, but also directly to the wealth tax? And that's because the wealth tax is a really big deal. As we've talked about in the past and as we talked about last week, it's really important to break down and understand why a wealth tax is trying to be passed in our state, what the impacts it would have on California, which would be huge and I argue very disastrous, and even what the underlying motives or heart behind a wealth tax are. And that's because it would reshape life. It would be a really big deal for our state to pass something like this. And again, we would see so many ramifications from it. So because of that, there are others who are against the wealth tax who want to try to counteract it. It's very likely that a wealth tax could be passed. Proposition 40 could pass come November. But if that is the case, we have to do everything we can to try to fight the effects that it would have. And so that's exactly what Propositions 41 and 42 do. They directly relate to this wealth tax, but they also relate to more important, broader conversations of what taxes are and how they should be handled here in our state. So let's take them one at a time to break them down and understand what they would really do and what the heart behind them is. So starting with Proposition 41. This is called the Improving Transparency, Effectiveness, and Efficiency in California Government Act of 2026, which is just such a long name, but pretty much sums up for you in a title what the proposition is looking to do. What it does is it imposes a few new rules for special taxes that are passed via ballot propositions here in California. So let's just go through them. The first rule: it requires new transparency requirements for special taxes that are voted on in elections, like we are seeing even with the wealth tax coming up in November. So first, we just need to break down what is a special tax. It's really important to understand that piece before we get to what these rules mean. A special tax means that it is money raised by our government for certain purposes that they legally earmark out. So in this case, if revenue is raised via a certain tax, it has to go to a certain program or go to certain expenses that were promised to voters. It can't just go to any sort of priority that our government lays out. This is very different from a general tax, in which case revenue is taken from the taxpayer and then it goes into the general fund. And so then we can set priorities in our government for where that money is going to be spent. A special tax has to be spent the way that it said it was going to be spent. It goes into a very specific fund to go towards certain programs or certain requirements. Now, what this proposition is looking to do, what the first rule that it's putting in place is that anytime a special tax is going to be on a ballot, it has to undergo an audit before it is presented to voters. So in the process of getting a proposition on a ballot, you have to raise signatures. Those are the people that we see out standing in front of Target or Walmart or whatnot asking you to sign for things. While it's raising signatures, it reaches certain benchmarks and thresholds. So what this proposition does is it says once it hits 25% of the signatures required to qualify to be on the ballot, then the state auditor has to go in and has to perform a special audit of the programs that this special tax would give the revenue toward. So let's say that there was a special tax that was going to go on the ballot that was promised to voters as saying that all of the funds would go toward funding homelessness. What would happen is if they reached 25% of the signatures that they needed, so not yet qualifying, but a quarter of the way there, the state auditor would have to go in and they would have to audit the homelessness programs in California first. And then they would have to be able to give that report to the voters before they are voting on that proposition. The purpose of this rule is to evaluate the proposed spending and to evaluate the current financial health of programs that money is supposedly going to be raised for. So if the state auditor goes in and says these programs are a mess, there's a bunch of fraud, waste, and abuse, then you as a voter can see clearly, I don't understand how raising more money for these programs would be effective because they already have a lot of money and it's being wasted. So the entire goal is greater transparency for the voter. So that's the first rule. The second rule is that once a special tax is passed, then it requires ongoing audits into the programs that receive revenue from those special taxes. So this is down the road. This is after the case in which it is presented to voters. Voters vote on it. Maybe they say, we like this. We are okay with our money going toward these programs. Well, now what Proposition 41 requires is that every 4 years, the programs that receive money from special taxes have to undergo an audit to make sure that the funds that are being taken from taxpayers toward those purposes are being spent the way that they were promised. So this is greater accountability. So the first rule is transparency. The second rule here is accountability, to say, government, you promised us that the revenue from this tax that was enacted would go toward this program. Is it doing that? And then the last rule that Proposition 41 implements is kind of technical, but important, so hang with me. Currently, under the California Constitution, there is a limit on how much tax revenue can be spent in our state year over year. But there are certain taxes that can be exempted from this spending limit. And so under current California law, there's certain spending that are not involved in that limit. And that often includes some of these special taxes that are passed by voters. What Proposition 41 would seek to do is to say that the state cannot exempt special taxes from that limit. So it would have to include all of the revenue that's spent from any special taxes that have been passed by voters in the annual spending limit. And so what that would do is it would essentially reduce or limit how much additional spending our state could take on year over year in special taxes, with the hoped or desired effect to reduce special taxes over the years that are being passed. So in summary, because that was a lot, Proposition 41 does three things. It requires initial audits of special taxes before they even qualify to be on the ballot. It requires ongoing audits of programs that are receiving funding from special taxes to provide greater transparency and accountability. Is the government doing what it promised to do? And then third, it requires that revenue from these special taxes will count toward the constitutional spending limit so that the government cannot evade that spending limit by just passing more and more and more special taxes. Those are the details. But what's the purpose? What's the heart? Do we really need this? How are we supposed to think about this? What is truly behind Proposition 41? Well, as I said, the real thrust of this proposition is accountability and transparency. We need this in California. If you have watched any part of this show or listened to this podcast, you know that I am constantly saying we need greater transparency into where our money is being spent. We need greater accountability because we have seen these scandals of fraud. We've seen so many programs that are being abused lately with taxpayer money. We also just see waste and incompetence of money going toward homeless programs that we have no idea where the money went. Money going toward the high-speed rail, and there is nothing to show for it. So California needs these things. It needs greater accountability. And the reason that we need this, when you really look at it, is because California does not lack revenue, yet we continually face budget deficits, and we have an just egregious cost of living that is felt by everybody who lives here. And so what I mean by that is the fact that we are the largest state, we have the greatest population, we have some of the highest taxes across the nation, and yet at the same time, we are constantly saying that we need more money because we need more programs. How can that be? The reason for that is that we have a spending problem. Our state continues to just spend more than it's able to take in. And so what we need to do is, first of all, our state needs to stop the bleeding. It needs to stop spending. But second of all, taxpayers need greater transparency to see where that money's actually going. Because it's really easy for the government to say, well, we need this money because we need to put it toward these programs, and then you never see it again. And you just you just assume, well, my money is going toward programs that must be functioning. When in reality, that money is either being stolen nefariously through fraud, or it's just being wasted on programs that are ineffective. And so you and I deserve to know that. We deserve to see where the money is going, because our tax dollars should be funding the programs that we ourselves are using and that our communities are using. So Proposition 41 is asserting that the government has a responsibility to show you where the money is going to go before it takes it, and then to continue showing you where it is going after it takes it. And I think that honestly is a fantastic idea. I don't even think that's a partisan issue. I think that we should all be able to agree that the government owes that to the people, because the government is made up of the people and is meant to represent the people. It's not just a mechanism that should be able to take your money and never tell you what it's doing with it. It should have to be accountable to you. Now, this does relate to Proposition 40, which is the wealth tax, because Proposition 40 creates a brand new special tax. That's exactly what it does. And the special tax, I believe, is purposed for healthcare spending. And so Proposition 41 would implement these transparency measures. It would say that the programs, the healthcare programs that are earmarked out to receive the revenue from the wealth tax would need to be audited to make sure that the funds are actually being used in a way that was promised to the voters. And then additionally, that spending would have to go toward that constitutional limit when it comes to the amount that the government is allowed to spend in a year. And so what it does is it just implements safeguards so that if Proposition 40 is passed, we have these safeguards to at least give us greater visibility into what is happening, and we can be more confident with where those funds are going. Or we can expose where they're going if it's negative, which it likely would be. But Proposition 41 is not the only proposition on our ballot that is positioned to actually work against the wealth tax, because Proposition 42 takes us a step further. So while Proposition 41 puts in place safeguards, Proposition 42 basically nukes the idea of the wealth tax altogether. This proposition itself states that it would, quote, prohibit new state personal property taxes and certain retroactive state taxes. So let's just break that down. What does that actually mean? What this means is that California does not currently tax the ownership of certain assets like stocks, investments, or business ownership. What California does tax is income that is generated from those activities. And so if you make money at your job, there's an income tax. If you sell a stock, there's usually a capital gains tax. If you make money from business ownership, there's taxes there as well. But taxing income generated from assets is very different from taxing just the value of the assets that you own in general. What Proposition 42 is seeking to do is preserve this distinction. It says California gets to tax over here. It gets to tax the income and the activity that is done year over year. It does not get to tax the second category, which is the ownership of actual assets. So what it does is it actually prevents California from ever implementing a tax on something that someone just owns, which awkwardly intersects with Proposition 40, because Proposition 40 That's all that it does. It's the wealth tax. So it only applies to your net worth, which is the assets that you own. So it exactly counterbalances to where if both of them passed, whichever had more votes would be the one that took effect, because 42 and 40 can't actually go hand in hand, since 40 is passing that type of tax and 42 is saying we can't pass that kind of tax. Additionally, there is also part of Proposition 42, which says that not only can California not tax the ownership of assets, but it also cannot pass retroactive taxes. And so that's another part of the wealth tax, because the wealth tax said that it's going to tax anybody who is a billionaire living in California as of January 1st of 2026. Well, that seems very unfair, because there could be people living in California who didn't know this proposition was going to be on the ballot. And so it should be forward-looking to say anyone who lives here after 2027 when it is enacted, but it doesn't do that. It's retroactive, and it does that for a reason, because people are going to leave. Anyway, it's a whole thing. And so Proposition 42 says, no, we're not doing that. Anytime you pass a tax, it needs to be forward-looking, not backwards looking. So basically, Proposition 42 would prevent a certain type of tax like the wealth tax from being implemented this year or any other year on into the future. So those are the details of Prop 42. But let's do what we did with Prop 41. Let's take a step back. Let's think outside of even just the specific wealth tax that is also on the ballot this year for a moment, and instead ask a few questions. Is a permanent ban proposed by 42 actually a good idea? Should government be able to tax the things that people own simply because they own them? And this is where it's just really important to understand the difference between activity and ownership. Because again, earning income or selling off investments or making money, those are activities where you are actually benefiting. That's income that you're earning that year that you then can spend and that can be paid out in taxes. It's a measurable transaction. But with ownership, this creates an obligation that says simply because you own things, now you owe the government money. And that's a really dangerous road to go down, because a lot of times the things that you own are probably not liquid. They're probably not in cash format where you can just hand the government a certain percentage of value for them. And so that is severely going to impact people who have business ownership or who have investments but haven't actually seen recognizable income from those investments or from that business ownership. Now they're going to have to pay the government out of their savings simply because they own something that they haven't actually received money from. I don't see how that makes any sort of sense. And this is where we have to circle back once again to the basics. What are taxes for? Taxes are meant to fund the essential functions of government that individuals cannot efficiently provide for themselves. That's things like public safety or infrastructure. You yourself cannot go out and efficiently just build a bridge in order to cross a river in your city or your state. And so it's recognized that that's something the government has to provide. But if you are going to be using that, and if that's going to be for the collective good, then you have to pay a little bit of money to the government in order for those things to be maintained and in order for those things to get done. That's the purpose of taxes, not to just be an unlimited source of revenue for any sort of program that the government comes up with in their minds and says that we want to raise money for. The purpose of taxes are not to just collect as much as possible or to fund their budget deficits because they were irresponsible for our money, or to just create new groups of people who they have deemed are taxable. They have enough money, we can just take from them so that we can fund these programs. That's dangerous thinking. That is not representing the people. That is not trying to be an efficient or lean government. That is just saying we can come up with any sort of programs that we want. We can spend your money in any sort of way we want. And then we can just say, you know what? You seem like you own enough things. You owe us a percentage of that. Proposition 42 seeks to keep the boundary in place between public taxation for all of those public goods and programs and private ownership. We cannot punish people for owning things. We can't punish people for owning homes and having equity in them. And we shouldn't punish people for owning investments or owning businesses or owning stocks or whatever they have. They should be able to own those things without thinking that the government is just going to come after them. This is America. We should have a right to private ownership. So Now that we understand what these propositions are in detail and what the purposes and intentions of them are, how should you vote on them? I feel like my answer is pretty obvious. I wholeheartedly believe that we can vote yes on Propositions 41 and 42, but let me give you 3 reasons why I think you should vote yes on them. The first is that these propositions address real issues that have led to decline in our state. So I say this all the time, that we don't want to pass laws that just put band-aids over bullet holes. We want to address real root causes, and we want to pass things that are going to be effective. What these propositions address and the things that they lay out to do are objectively good things. We have called so often for more transparency. We have called for greater accountability in our government, and we have said that the mindset that would actually support a wealth tax is destructive and is not going to support excellence. It is not going to push forward innovation in our state. So if we believe all of those things, then we have to vote for them. If we say we need greater transparency, we have to vote for it when it's put on the ballot. If we think a wealth tax is destructive, we have to vote against it and vote for something that would prevent it in the future if it's put on the ballot. And so Props 41 and 42 are not just virtue signaling. They're not just another Band-Aid fix. These are addressing real underlying causes, and it's trying to enact measurable change and solutions. Second, these propositions would counteract a very disastrous policy. I have beat this horse before, so I don't need to re-explain why a wealth tax would be disastrous in our state, but it would have significant economic impact. It would discourage investment, discourage entrepreneurship. It would move billionaires out of our state. It would move businesses out of our state, and ultimately that would just hurt our economic growth. This is not something to be toyed with. It's not something to be played with, and it's certainly not something to be ignored. And so these propositions are seeking to actively counteract its effects. We can't be blind to the fact that Proposition 40, the wealth tax, may very well pass. And so we have to do everything humanly possible to either keep that from happening and convince people of why it would be damaging, or to then pass measures that would put good safeguards in place or would prevent it from being able to be enacted altogether. And lastly, and most importantly, these propositions provide you with a tangible way to make your voice heard on issues like these. In California, it is so easy to think that we have no voice, we have no ability to change anything. It's frustrating to talk about certain policies that are put in place, even policies like a wealth tax, because it feels like we can't really do anything about it. Here is our chance. We can do something about it, not just to vote against Proposition 40, not just to advocate for a negative, but to vote positively for Propositions 41 and 42. We need to realize here that we have a real opportunity to vote for transparency, accountability, and stewardship of taxpayer dollars. I sing that every single day. I say that is what we need. And so here we have it on our ballots in front of us. We need to recognize the great privilege that it is before us, the great weight that there is behind that privilege in being able to have a say in implementing these changes, which would be wonderful in our government. And then we need to steward that privilege wisely. So to do that, as you head to the ballot box this November and make a plan for how you are going to vote, you absolutely need to plan to vote yes on Propositions 41 and 42. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope it was helpful for you as you navigate life in our state, and that it's helping you as you start to think through these propositions that are going to be on the ballot come this November. If you love this show, please spread the word and share it with your friends, family, and fellow Californians. And I'll see you back here next week for another episode of the California Conversation.